Hello and welcome to the first video of what's going to be many. I'm sure we have a lot to cover, so hopefully this video approach, you guys find this helpful. I want to encourage you to experiment on your own, go beyond the videos that I give you. What I give you is going to be the absolute minimum. I think the course requires a little bit of extra independent study. So I want to encourage you to go out and find small projects, whether it be your dorm rooms, your parents' house, your friend's house. Try to push yourself to put as much stuff into Revit as possible. So what we're going to cover today isn't a lot on this video. It's going to pretty much just cover the navigation, kind of recap on what we went over briefly in the last class. If you remember what we're staring at now, this is the main screen. All right, this is going to have your recent projects. And I touched on families a little bit. Families we're going to talk about here in a few other videos or a few other weeks. The families are basically blocks. If you think back to AutoCAD, whenever you wanted to place a lot of the same thing, we would place blocks. But in Revit, we're gonna place families. So what we're going to focus on today is the new project. This is where we navigate our projects. So we're going to go to a new project, and that's going to give us a template of Autodesk version of a new project. So that opens up here. Now if you remember, we talked about the project browser and how important the project browser is. You might be showing that properties box down here that looks somewhat similar to this. That might be dragged down in here or over here. And if you remember, I said I usually keep that closed because I like to have as much screen real estate that I possibly can when I work on this. So usually I just keep the project browser open. If it's closed or there's other views you can always remember go up to view and user interface. And these are kind of like your toolbars that you can open up. So you can open up that properties box, recent files, navigation bar, and you can see the ones that are checked are already open as the project browser. This is your project browser. Your status bar, which is going to be down here, and so on and so forth. So this is where you're going to go to add windows to your screen if they're missing, or if you want to get rid of them, you can uncheck those as well. So this is our drawing screen in AutoCAD. If you remember, it was black. In Revit, it's going to be white. There are ways to change that. We're not going to focus on that right now. Like I said, I kind of just want to get you attuned to the user interface. Alright, so the user interface is pretty straightforward. All Autodesk products have acquired this ribbon concept that I think Microsoft Word was the first to put on the market, and since most programs have followed. So everything that we're going to need is going to be within these ribbons up here in the top. So the ribbons are going to contain most of your modeling categories, most of your view categories. You can see here if you're going to import AutoCAD stuff or any other Revit information, you're going to go to the Insert tab, and you'll have to look around here just to get used to it. Now remember, in Autodesk now, if you hover over top of something that you're interested in, it's going to give you more information, and I highly recommend you do this while you're getting used to the program. If there's something you're not quite sure exactly what it does, just kind of hover over it for a second and kind of sit there, and you'll see the screen kind of gets bigger and it gives you more detailed information. Some of these have more information than others, like the wall you can see here shows some images of different wall setups. So as you go through these toolbars and you're interested in what something might actually be, kind of just hover over it for a second and get the information. You can also see here that under the text, if you press F1 while you're hovering over that item, the help will automatically direct you to that item, so you don't have to search for anything once you're in text. Whatever you hover over and press F1, say I press F1 now, whatever I'm hovering over is going to pop up the Revit help, and that help is going to be on arc length, so I'm not going to have to search for that. So that pulls up here, on arc length, Revit's help. So definitely use the help. Help's going to be major for you guys on your independent studies, and I'll let you know now that Autodesk is pretty good about keeping their help up to date. So you're going to want to use that as much as possible. Today, like I said, we're not going to really model anything. I might pull out some things just to kind of show you, but you're going to want to go through these tabs and check them out. The View tab we'll use a lot. Obviously the Modify tab we'll use a lot. This is where we're going to come to do some of our post stuff. As you'll see, some of these symbols might be similar to AutoCAD. This offset is pretty much the same symbol that you'll find, and we'll see some differences in how that tool is used, but it still has the same concept, as well as the mirror tools here, and the move tool and the copy tool and so on and so forth. So we'll get into this stuff more next week. I just want you to get a feeling for where everything's at this week. So obviously structure we're not going to use as much. I will introduce grid lines because I think that's important. That's something you're going to see in just about every drawing. And we will use floors. We won't use structural walls as much as we'll use these basic walls here. So we'll spend most of our time in the home and modify tabs, but we'll use some things from other tabs here and there. Your drop down to do your basic file operations are going to be up here where this large R is. New drawings, open drawings, save, print, and so on and so forth. We won't really print anytime soon. We'll have to create sheets before we start printing, so we won't use a whole lot here. Your program options are located here. These are like the program options. These aren't drawing options, so this has to do with the Revit program itself. You can see you have your notification for saves. This will remind you if you haven't saved in a while, and some other things that we're not really worried about. So you don't really need to come into here often. This is more for advanced applications and so on and so forth. So we won't worry about this too much, especially today. The project browser, if you'll remember, is probably the most important area in Revit when it comes to navigating through your project, simply because this is how you jump from levels, this is how you jump from different drawings, this is how you go to elevations, this is how you add levels, this is how you locate families that you have in your drawings, this is how you'll locate your sheets and legends and schedules. So this is, the project browser is huge. This is how you navigate to everything. And as you can see, we have our floor plan already set up here, and we have our ceiling plan already set up here. Now these names they come from something that's predefined, a template that's in Revit, and we'll talk about creating our own templates later on, possibly maybe like week 6 or so, or week 7. We're not going to get into that quite yet. That's a little more advanced, but you can see it gives us our ceiling plans and our floor plans, which are our basics. Now, for all purposes, we can rename these if we want to, if you remember, to something that's a little more familiar to you, and that's fine. And you can do that by right-clicking and going to rename. And if you remember, we can name this something, let's say ground floor. And it's going to give us this message, would you like to rename corresponding levels and views? And what this basically means, obviously with every first floor, especially if you have a second floor or any other floor, you're going to have a ceiling plan that goes with it. And you can see you have level 1 here, and then you have a ceiling plan over here that's also level 1. So it would make sense to go ahead and change this name if we're going to change this name, so we don't confuse ourselves. So this is basically Revit saying, hey, you have other levels out there that need to be renamed as well. Do you want us to do that for you automatically? So 9 times out of 10, you're going to want to hit yes here. And you'll see that that renames not only your floor plan, but your ceiling plan as well. And if we jump to the elevation, any of these elevations will work. You'll see it also renamed our datum as well here, and our tags. So Revit is very good about updating information. It's called parametric data, and that is one of the key factors besides work sets that Revit offers. That's something that AutoCAD doesn't offer. So this is also where you're going to want to go to add levels. Anytime that you need to add a level, you have to do it in an elevation view. You can't do it in a floor plan, which makes sense because if you have to add a level in a floor plan, you're looking down. And if you're looking down on something, it's hard to give it a height. So as you'll see, you'll need to come to elevation views to add levels, and you can do that by going to the View tab. Let's see, View tab. Am I missing? Oh, I'm sorry, the home tab and then the level here. So you want to go to the home tab and then level, and then you're going to click and actually click on the opposite side of where you want your datum to be, and you'll just drag that over like that. So that automatically drops a level in there. Not only does it create a level here, it creates your level over here as well. So now you see, now we have a level 3, which before we didn't, as well as we have a level 3 here. So it's going to update that for you automatically. Now when you click on elements, you'll see you'll get little drag bars here. These little circles represent being able to click. These check boxes have to do with datums. If we didn't want this datum here, which is this element here, to be visible, we would uncheck that, and that'll get rid of that. Obviously we want that on at least one side, but you can see Revit offers you the ability to do that on both sides if you want by checking this checkbox. And we'll find out when we get into families a little bit more how this is actually created and how we can control our own custom datums and symbols. But for now we want to drag this little circle over, and you'll see we get a dashed line which represents the snap, that it's aligned, and we want that dashed line to be there. We also want this to be locked because that assures us that it's not going anywhere. You'll also notice when you click on these components that you get a measurement that pops up. Okay, whenever you see a measurement like this in Revit that's blue that automatically pops up, this represents a temporary dimension. Right, then this is how you enter heights and widths. This is how you tell the difference between where you want things to be placed. It's not like AutoCAD where you have a command line down here and you type in polar coordinates and so on and so forth, which you could go into the relative coordinate system, Cartesian coordinate system, or whatever, but Revit doesn't function that way, mainly because there is no coordinate system in Revit, which could be a little confusing at first. There is no 0, 0 to say in Revit until you get into creating your own points. When you need to import AutoCAD files, you'll find sometimes when you're trying to correspond with site or even structural or civil engineering, you're going to need to create a temporary coordinate system, and you can do that. But by default, there's no coordinate system. So in Revit, everything's done off of these temporary dimensions. So to keep it consistent, it looks like this is 10 feet. So I need to select the line that I actually want to move, and I want to move this element, and then I come here and click on this and just type in 10 feet, and you'll see that moves that to 10 feet. So that's good. That's what we want. We want that to be 10 feet. And it's always good practice when you're dealing with grid lines and elevations to come up here and pin this. And a pin, basically, like this help says, it locks a model element in place, and I'll let you read that on your own if you want to hover over it, but I'll select pin there, and you'll see it puts a little pin there, and that pin assures me that I can't move this anywhere. Alright, that's locked in space, so I can't accidentally drag this or enter a dimension to move it. In order to move it, I need to click on the pin and unpin it, or I can click on it again to pin it, so I can unpin it and pin it if I need to move it again. But a pin's basically an insurance that I don't accidentally click and move that thing again. So now I have 3 levels, and I could go to that 3rd level if I wanted to, or the ground floor. Okay, let's talk about the grid lines. I mentioned that I like to bring those up, and I like to bring them up because you're going to see them a lot when you're working with other architects and engineers. Everything on a drawing is based off of a grid line. Okay, grid lines mark columns, grid lines mark structural walls. Grid lines are your reference when it comes to a drawing. So I feel like just about every drawing that we do, we're going to need to incorporate grid lines into it. Even though interior designers and interior architects most of the time won't need to do that, it's good to know what they're there for and to realize their importance. So to go ahead and get started on the grid lines, we're going to make sure we're on the ground floor to do that, because our grid lines need to be on the base floor, and they'll be on every level above that, but to be safe, we'll draw them on the ground floor to start off with. So I'm going to go to, I don't know why I like to go to view so much, it seems like that's where I keep going. I'm going to go to the home tab, and you'll see the datum here as well where the level was. Grids are here as well, so I'm just going to place that. I'm going to click grid. Now you'll see every time that I activate a command, whether it be grid or wall, whatever it might be, this modify turns green, and it has a line there and then it says place wall. So notice every time that I select a command, these custom modified tabs are going to change for that command depending on what I'm in. So it's important to realize that this Modify tab is activated, and it's actually going to be different than just the regular Modify tab for each instance that I select here. So let's go ahead and select Grid again on the Home tab, and you'll see I have my Modify Place Grid. So I'll just come through here and just start clicking, making sure that this says 90 degrees and that I have a nice straight grid line. You know, sometimes your grid lines will be at weird degrees. It just depends, but for now let's go ahead and use the built-in ortho that Revit offers and draw nice grid lines for this little example here. And I'm not going to space them anything special. I'm just going to start drawing them. Go back and space them after the fact. So I am making sure that I'm snapping with my dashed line across here. You'll see that pops up there, that little automatic snap. And those are automatic. It's not like that's an AutoCAD where you have to check them on and off. Those are going to be automatic, so that's a nice feature. And I'll do, that'll work. So you'll also see if I zoom in here, Revit automatically numbers these in order. So that's kind of a help too. If you remember in AutoCAD, whenever we had blocks like this, their attributes, we would have to go in and we would have to manually change each one of these. So Revit's good about this kind of information being updated. That's one thing about Revit, is there's a lot of work up front, but it pays off in the end, as we'll find out, especially when we get into things like legends and wall types and details and stuff like that. So, and then I'm going to go ahead and do some horizontal ones here. And I'm going to change that to the letter A. And you'll see now it's doing the alphabet for me, which is convenient. So now my horizontal lines, which are usually your vertical and your horizontal, are numbered in letters, kind of like Battleship. So you can come in and pick your coordinate system using your specified letters and numbers here. So either or, for the case of this class, each firm, each standard is going to have different ideas on the matter, but for my class I'm just concerned that you have numbers either horizontal or vertical, and you have letters horizontal or vertical, as long as they're different. Obviously that makes it easier to pick a point. So I know that D2, for example, is right here. So it looks like I got a little carried away here on these two, so no big deal. I just click the object and then click the little circle here, and you can drag it, and that'll drag both of those into line there. And that's kind of what we want. Looks good. Now I can go through here and space these. We'll just keep them close to what I have here. It looks like I have 20, so I'll just make it an even 20 feet. That's 20 feet, and I click this one. That's 20 feet. Now this says 19.6. I want to make sure that this stays at 20. So if you remember what I talked about earlier, is the pen, and we obviously don't want these grid lines to move, right? The grid lines is what everything's based off of, so we want to make sure these are stationary. So what I'm going to do on these first grid lines especially is pin this first one here. Okay, when I pin that, that means that everything's going to be based off of this grid line now. And I'll go ahead and pin this one since it's closest to my bubbles down here. It doesn't matter, it could have been either way. And I'll pin that as well. That way those two are locked in place, so I know they're not moving. So everything's based off of this. So I have 20 feet from here to here. Now if I want this line to move, the line that you want to move needs to be selected. So if I was to change this dimension, it's going to change in this way. So that's not good. So I want to go to the next one. Again, this is 20. That's what I want. This is 19.6. So I need this one to move over 6 inches. So I'll select this one, and I'll change this one to 20. Notice that moved that line over, so now that's 20, that's 20, so we're moving it over. So whatever line that you want to move needs to be blue. Obviously I don't want this one to move. This one needs to be moved over to 20 feet as well, so I'll select this line and change it to 20. And last but not least, this guy out here, I'll change that to 20. And now that I have all of these, I'll hit Control and select all of these at the same time, and I'll select Pin, and that'll pin all of those for me. So by holding Control while selecting, I can select multiple objects. And that's true with any objects, that's not just grid lines. Alright, so I'll go through and clean these up. Next, this is set to 12.6, so I'll just go ahead and change that to 13 feet. And I'll go through and change all these to 13 feet. Alright, and I'll select all of those and add pins to those as well, because I want those to be locked. Now these grids, if I try and click and drag, they're not going anywhere. Alright, they're locked in place for good. I got a little stray here. The dimension's black. Remember, the dimensions we were working with before were blue. If the dimension's black, I must have accidentally clicked one to be permanent. No big deal. I select it and hit delete, and that'll get rid of that. We don't need any dimensions yet. Dimensions, you know, from past classes are kind of like the final touch, so we won't worry about dimensions for a while. Now, if I wanted to tighten this up a little bit, the fact that these are pinned should not affect the ability. Notice I can turn on and off the datum, but I'm not going to be able to click and move those up. In order for those to move, I'm going to have to actually unpin all of these. So I'll go through and unpin these, and to move these bubbles, now I can move these bubbles up to kind of get them a little bit closer there. And then obviously I'm going to have to select them all again and hit pin, and that'll pin them back in place. So you want to make sure if you unpin something, you pin them back in place. Alright, let's look at a couple other things about the grid lines before we move on. If I select one of these grid lines, remember before I turned off the properties bar, so there's no properties showing up if you've closed this. If you have it open, you'll notice the properties are cycling as you change these objects. To fix that, I'm going to select it and I'm going to right click and go to properties, and that's going to bring up that same properties box that you probably have open. Now these property boxes are going to change from element to element, not so much for grid lines because every grid line is going to have the same property. Okay, now we have what we call our instance properties, which would be the instance of that element, and then we have our type properties, which in hierarchy would be above that. So you have the type of grid line, which would cover any grid line that you have, and then you have an instance, which is this particular grid line. Now this grid line has the name E, or the letter E, and this grid line's D. So the difference between the instance of this and this is obviously just the letter and the location. Now the type is going to be the same for all of these grid lines. If I go to the edit type, you'll see this covers the type properties of all grid lines under the system family grid. We'll talk about families, but just remember for now this is kind of like a block in AutoCAD. It's a little more advanced than a block in AutoCAD, but we are in the grid block basically of a 1/4 inch bubble. So that's for 1/4 inch drawings. The 1/4 inch scale is what that represents. Now if I was to change something in here, it's going to change all of the grid lines, all instances, because type is above instance in the hierarchy. So for example, this is on grid line 1/2 inch. Let's see if I change this to, and you'll see the type of grid line, you get that that repeat of long and short, almost like a phantom line. Let's see, what's going to give us, let's just do hidden. Let's do hidden and see what happens with hidden. If I hit apply, you'll notice that changes all instances of that to a hidden line. Okay, so now these are hidden. They're no longer what they were before. There's a bunch of different line types in here, as you'll see, just like in AutoCAD. So I'll change that back to my 1/2 inch grid line there, and now they're back to normal. So be aware, whenever you change something in type properties, it's going to change everything, and you'll see this will burn you more when we get into furniture families and such than grid lines. But if we do want to make a modification, it's usually good to duplicate that. Okay, when we duplicate, we create a copy, and I can create a copy, that way I know that's my custom name and I can rename it after I duplicate it. For instance, instead of this quarter bubble custom gap, quarter bubble gap, I could come in here and do a duplicate and rename this Jason's bubble. You would probably want to name this something a little more appropriate, but Jason's bubble seems okay now, and now you'll see that I have my own type. So now if I change this, it's going to change everything, but that's okay because I still have the other one backed up. And it's important that I don't go and change everything without doing a duplicate. So it's good practice to always make a duplicate whenever you change a type property, because if you overwrite the system, then you're not going to get that back, especially if you forget what it was. So it's good practice to make sure you change your type property. So I can always have that 1/4 inch bubble still, and notice it goes back. So I'll have my customs. So we'll talk about type properties a lot throughout. It's just important to realize what you're dealing with. So you'll see here is my custom bubble, and it's my grid Jason's bubble right there, that same type property. But as an instance, the only difference that separates this from anything else is the letter E. So I can change that back here to my 1/4 bubble. So properties we'll talk about, it can be a little confusing. You really want to hit your readings on the difference between an instance property and a type property. I'll be sure to make sure you're well aware of it throughout. It's a big deal, I know. That confuses a lot of people, so I'll be sure to try and point that out as much as possible. So now that we have these grid lines, we can go ahead and start dropping in some columns. Now, that would be the next step, and I know most interior designers and architects hate dealing with columns because they usually end up right where you don't want one. So I'm going to force this class especially to use grid lines and columns just to keep it a little more real world and a little more practical. Revit makes it super easy to add columns. It's not a hassle, especially if you have a rectangle building like we have here. We're kind of fortunate to have this shape because it's going to be easy to add columns. So you can see here on the Home tab I have a structural column tool here. If I hit this, I have architectural and structural. For this purpose, we'll just stick to a structural column. And you'll see when I do that, it loads in under my properties here a wide flange column, W10 by 49. There's only 2 of them in here by default. We can open up more by going to Load Family under my Modify. So if I wanted to add different columns, I could go to Load Family. That's going to pull up my Imperial library, which is by default. Revit's got all of these already here, so that you should see an Imperial. There's also a metric. There's a folder just for columns, and depending on what kind of column you wanted, you can see you can go through these columns here. I'm going to go to structural steel columns though, because I want structural columns. Those were more architectural, and now you can see we get more of the structural stuff. So if I cycle through these, and we're not really worried about this as much as a structural engineer would be. We kind of just want to put these in here for now. Typically these are already going to be there by the time we get a Revit file. I just want you to see the basics of the grid lines and the columns. So we'll stick with the W wide flange. And this is a chart of all the different types in the spec sheets, and it gives you all of the specs. So I'll hit OK there. And it kicked me out of there, so I'm going to go back to Home, back to Column, back to Structural. And it looks like I didn't load all those in there. So I'm going to go back to Load Family, and I'm going to go down to Structural, Columns, Steel, W-wide flange, and I actually need to select these, so I'm going to hold down Shift and select that. You don't need all of these. Just to show you can select all of them, I'm going to select all of them and hit OK. It's going to say I've selected a lot of them, which is good because you really don't need to select all of them, but for this purpose we'll go ahead and continue. And you can see down here the progress bar is taking a long time. So obviously that's a bad sign. So in the future we're going to want to steer away from this kind of stuff. Alright, so now we should have a lot of things in here, and we do. We have a lot of different families now for these W-wide flange columns. And since we went through all the trouble, we're not going to want to use 10 by 49 because that's what was in here automatically. So let's go ahead and do something a little different, 10 by 100. And you'll see now once I select that, I can come out here and place it. And you'll see the snap of the dashed line And you'll also see down here, down in the lower left-hand corner of my screen, you'll see that I have a snap between grids grid 1 and grids grid E. So that's telling me that I'm snapped. Those brackets and the and sign represents that I'm snapped with the nearest snap there. So if you're not sure where you're snapping, you can always refer to that command prompt. So I'll click there. And it's basically as simple as going around and clicking and clicking and clicking. And you're wanting to make sure that you get your snaps, because you don't want your column off of one of your lines there. Now this is okay, it's not bad. We can go through and click each one of these, no big deal. But if I delete those, I'm hitting escape to get out of that command, by the way. So I'll hit escape until I'm out, and then I'll select all the columns that I just created, and I'll hit delete on the keyboard. Now under this column tool, you should notice that this again is the modified thing I was talking about. This turns green, so you'll notice this is green here, this is green here, and this whole area is green, and this is green all the way down through here. So this tells you that this is all connected under the modified structural column. So all of this information is going to be different depending on what exactly it is that we're selecting. So this is all relevant to the modify place structural columns, and you'll notice that this changes. The important thing to see here is we've created grids, so I can create an intersection of all of my grids by selecting. So you'll see, like AutoCAD, it tells me what it wants me to do down here. It says select grid lines to place structural columns intersecting points. So I'll just select all of my grid lines, and then you'll notice it gives me a preview. By automatically selecting all those, it's dropped at an intersection all of these columns. So that was a lot quicker than going around and placing a column at each point. So if I'm okay with this, I can come up here and hit finish, and that will okay it, and then I'll have my columns here. Again, if I select one of these columns, you'll see that it has its own properties. Now remember, these are the instance properties, so anything that I change in here is only going to affect this column. Now if I go in to edit the type, anything I change in here is going to affect all of the columns, but it's also going to affect this. And if I change something that's not true to this type of column, then I've really created a major error that could cause problems in the future. So anytime that I modify a type property, I want to make sure that I always do a duplicate and rename it as something else to be more accurate to what it actually is. You'll also notice in the properties that my base level for this column is actually the ground floor, which is what I want it to be on, and it goes to the level 2. Now you're going to see this with all elements, especially walls. If this column actually goes higher than level 2, let's say this column goes up to level 3, I'll make that column go to level 3. You know, they might all need to go to level 3, but I want to kind of show you what's going on here. If I go to an elevation view, I can, by the way, go here to an elevation view, or I can select one of these markers. If there's an elevation view that I want, I can double click on the triangle part of it, and it will automatically take me to that view. And here are my columns now that I've created. You can see by default that column is based on the ground floor, and it goes up to level 2. However, the one that I changed to level 3 goes up to level 3, and you'll see this one goes to level 3 and this one's based to ground. Now the base offset does just what it says. If by chance I wanted that to be hovering above the ground in some fashion, then I could change the base offset. Normally not something that we would really do. It's almost like a nudge, if you would. The top offset, the same deal. We could offset the top a certain distance. Column style is vertical. You'll notice that each of these properties is going to change. A lot of times this constraint area will be the same for most properties. There's also some things down here as phase created, which you'll get into if it's existing. You know, if you're doing an addition onto a building, sometimes you're going to want to organize this stuff, and we'll see later on why. And phase demolished, if you're doing a demolition plan, it could be huge for you to go ahead and set this stuff up now if you're demolishing things, and that'll give you the ability to do a demolition plan with ease later on if you set this up now. So if there's stuff that's existing and there's stuff that's new construction, sometimes you'll want to set these filters here. So basically we've covered the little bit of the user interface. We've started to draw a few things here. We started to define the creation of levels and grid lines. So what we have now, if I go to my ground floor, is actually the starting point for where you could go in and start adding your walls. And I don't want to take it much further than this today, so we'll wrap it up here. Hopefully this helped. Be sure to add any suggestions. If you're having difficulties still, let me know. We'll figure a solution out. For next week, make sure that you get a hold of the book that was suggested for the course and do your readings. And we'll start talking about creating floor plans next week.